Welcome to the Electric Wire Podcast. We bring you news and views on the most pressing issues facing Wisconsin's electric industry, from policymakers, executives, and customer and environmental advocates. Bringing you these discussions, we are the Customers First Coalition. Here's your host, Executive Director Kristen Jilks.
Welcome to the Electric Wire. I'm your host, Kristen Jilks, and I'm so excited to be welcoming Marcus Hawkins, who is the Executive Director of the Organization of MISO States, in today's episode. Marcus is going to give us some context about his organization, OMS, and MISO, the Midwest Independent System Operator. To level set, I'm going to give you a little bit more background on MISO from its website. MISO, again, the Midwest Independent System Operator, is an independent, not-for-profit, member-based organization focused on three critical tasks: managing the flow of high-voltage electricity, that's transmission, across 15 U.S. states and the Canadian province of Manitoba, facilitating one of the world's largest energy markets with more than $40 billion in annual transactions, and planning the future of the grid. 45 million people depend on MISO to generate and transmit the right amount of electricity every minute of every day, reliably, dependably, and cost-effectively. MISO became the nation's first FERC approved Regional Transmission Organization, or RTO, on December 20th, 2001. A few years after MISO was founded, Marcus's Organization of MISO States, or OMS, came along. OMS was established to represent the collective interests of state and local utility regulators in the MISO territory. With such a large service area and impact on electric customers, I am so thankful to have Marcus here today, giving us a primer on OMS, energy markets, grid operators, the impact of regional transmission organizations, and more. Ever since we started the Electric Wire, I've wanted to bring Marcus on as a guest because his background as an engineer and enthusiasm for these issues make him so informative and also so approachable. Now, here's my interview with Marcus Hawkins. So, Marcus, I knew when I met you in 2018 or 2019 at a NARUC.
Yeah.
I was like, I feel like he would be such a good podcast guest because you're just so friendly and everyone likes you. And it's just like, and you've got all this knowledge on these issues. It's just kind of a perfect match.
Well, that's very flattering. And I think that's part of the reason why I kind of love my job, is I work with a ton of different people and I seem to get along with all of them, even though they all have very different backgrounds and thoughts on some pretty contentious issues. So makes my life fun.
Nice. And we were just saying too that I was on your website and MISO's website and LinkedIn trying to remind myself of all the issues that you deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Tell us, Marcus, how did you get there? How did you start thinking about these issues all the time? What's your background and how did you get to OMS?
Certainly. So my background is I went to school here in Madison, where we both are, and studied nuclear engineering. And during that time, I also got to work at a nuclear power plant here up near Green Bay. And I really realized my interests in the energy industry were broader than just nuclear energy, even though it is still my favorite of all the sources of power that are out there. So I went into a graduate program here at UW that was focused on energy systems more broadly. And so it kind of expanded my horizons into the energy policy and just all the different types of energy generation that are out there. So after I received my master's degree, one of the projects that I had worked on got me studying this thing called MISO, and I had never heard about it. And I was learning about like demand response programs and how the grid operator can save everybody money by reducing load at certain times. And so that was my first introduction into something bigger than just a utility that serves customers electricity. And so from there, I went and worked at a consulting firm that analyzed all the different regions of the country and really helped investment banks buy power plants. And you had to try to understand the rules of how a power plant might make money and like what are the different markets that they operate in. And so it was really, really interesting to try to understand all these different types of power plants. It could be hydro, could be wind, could be a natural gas plant. What is it worth and who wants to own it, and how will they make money off of it? So in that job, I really started to understand these wholesale markets, these wholesale power markets that operate all over the country, and sort of like really started to dig in and become an expert in these wholesale markets. And then from there, I moved back to Madison, and there was an interesting new opening at the Public Service Commission. And they were starting to create a team that was focused completely on the wholesale power market that Wisconsin utilities participate in, which is MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. And so because the commission regulates utilities that operate under this big wholesale market, the commission needs to understand it and it needs to weigh in at the MISO level to represent their own interests. And so they had a small team that really just focused on bigger regional and federal energy policy issues that were kind of outside the borders of Wisconsin. And so that was very similar to what I was doing at that consulting firm. And so I saw this job and I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. Like what I was doing all over the country, I could focus on Wisconsin, and, that gives me, joy as a public servant, working for my home state. And then spent a couple years doing that when my predecessor reached out to me and said, hey, Marcus, you should consider working at the Organization of MISO States, which is kind of that little group that I worked on at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin, but focused on the whole MISO region, so a 15-state region. And so I kind of saw it as my dream job here in Madison at the commission, kind of on steroids, working for a bunch of different commissioners and commissions. And so that's sort of my path that got me to the Organization of MISO States.
It sounds like MISO was created in 2001. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more of the backstory on that. And then a couple years later, OMS came to be. Yep. Why did there need to be an OMS if there's a MISO?
Yes, great question. So in the early 2000s, it was really a federal policy push to introduce wholesale competition for electricity. So it was coming from the Energy Policy Act and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to encourage competition of generation so that customers could benefit from the cheapest electricity possible. And so in doing that, you need to have someone who's kind of overseeing the transmission system and making sure that every generator can compete fairly and follow the same rules. And so it was really in those early 2000s when these wholesale energy markets and what is known as open access to the transmission system was first created. It used to be that every utility owned their own generation, served their own load, and owned their own transmission lines, and kind of had their own little piece, their own little kingdom. But that's not the most economically efficient way or the most reliable way to do things, because depending on the weather or the fuel costs in your different region, you might be able to ship electricity around a little more cheaply. And so that's when FERC was promoting these regional transmission organizations. And so MISO was created, and their energy market really wasn't stood up until 2003. And that is when OMS came into existence. So as FERC was promoting RTOs, of which MISO is one, they were also really concerned with how do states get represented in these new regional organizations? Because up until that point, utility commissions had been regulating their own jurisdictional utilities and looking out for their own customers. And that was fine. That was well and good. But as soon as you become part of a regional entity, FERC was really concerned, well, how do states then have a role in that regional market that's now federally regulated? Because as soon as you introduce interstate commerce, that becomes subject to federal jurisdiction. So as you create a multi-state market, you need to have an ability for state regulators who are still responsible for their customers in their own state to have a voice and to have a meaningful way to participate in that regional entity. And so that is when FERC, when they were creating and approving these multi-state wholesale electricity markets, and I can kind of explain more of what all of those words mean, as FERC was creating those and incentivizing them, they were asking for input. How will states be represented in this process? And so what is now known as a regional state committee was kind of that idea was put out there. And so every market that is a multi-state wholesale power market has what's known as a regional state committee. And so OMS is a regional state committee. And so when MISO went back to FERC and got approved as a regional transmission organization, they're in their founding documents there actually refer to OMS. And it says, this is our group of state regulators, and this is how they're going to be represented within MISO. And this is their specific roles, and they have certain authorities and things like that. So we've really been around since the beginning of MISO. It's just that MISO has evolved over time to take on more responsibilities over the power grid. And so I like to think of it as we've kind of been around since, the MISO that we know today started, and that was in 2003.
Okay, perfect. What were they doing until 2003 if they were founded in 2001?
Yes. So, and they even go back before 2001. So there was basically like coordination of different schedules. So it used to be you would reserve sending power over a transmission line from point A to point B. And so they would kind of be the overseer of different utilities striking deals and, making sure that the transmission system wasn't oversubscribed in any one way. Now we're in like a real-time energy market where all of that is sort of happening instantaneously. But before that, you could kind of think of them as like, being a reservation keeper, where they would say, okay, the utility A wants to sell it to utility B. We have this path to do it. And they would kind of organize and orchestrate all of those different transactions. But it was much more rudimentary back then.
So how do you keep track of what is going on at MISO on a day-to-day basis?
That's a great question. I have a very full calendar because MISO has, I think it's like north of 400 stakeholder and technical meetings a year. And it's
my
crazy.
gosh.
There's one still going on right now that I've been on since like 8 a.m. this morning. And so it really goes to, how OMS is organized. Like OMS's ability to follow all of this is based on the fact that we have 17 member agencies that are all of the utility commissions that are within the MISO region. So there's 15 states, the province of Manitoba and the city of New Orleans are the OMS members. And they all have one commissioner that serves on the OMS board of directors. And that's who I report to and who can hire and fire me. And then they all have staff that support them in their own agencies as well. And so OMS is really a convener of these commission staffs and these experts that are spread throughout the Midwest and the Gulf Coast. And so the only way anyone can stay up to speed on everything that MISO is working on is kind of sharing the load. And so we regularly convene staff from across the OMS membership to just sort of recap and report out as to what's going on. And that's really the only way it's possible.
So right now, what are they talking about at MISO and what are you following?
So there's a couple really big things going on right now. So Right now, we're in year 2 or 3 of what is known as MISO's long-range transmission planning initiative, where MISO is looking out into the future with their utilities and with their states as to like what future generators are going to be there on the system 20 years down the line, and trying to analyze the transmission system that would be needed to support those generators. So as everybody knows, the electric system is changing pretty rapidly, and it's happening all over the MISO footprint. And so the transmission lines that were built to serve from large, central source generators to, cities might not be the same as what's needed to interconnect the generators of tomorrow. And so MISO is working with everybody to understand what generation might be expected, what generators are going to retire, and then plan a transmission system that can be reliable and economically efficient. And so there's a ton of modeling and assumptions and different scenarios that you got to look at to make sure you're building a transmission system that is justifiable at each of these state commissions, because the states still have authority to cite transmission in their borders. And so we're participating in this regional process that's looking at a pretty expansive build out of transmission and trying to make sure that the transmission that is being planned and modeled is being modeled accurately and is being planned for the right reasons. And so that's something that we are very involved in, is MISO's transmission planning process. And then the other big thing is related to what is known as resource adequacy, ensuring that there's enough generation to meet customers' needs at all times. So there's been a couple of pretty, big blackouts recently in California and Texas where there wasn't sufficient generation to meet needs. And so that can happen from, generators breaking, going on outage, or just extremely high demands from really cold or really hot weather. We have a very hot day today in Madison. And so the states are in charge of making sure they have enough generation. But it's the grid operator that operates all that generation to make sure the system is reliable. And so in any area where there's like that overlap between a role of a state regulator and the role of the grid operator, that's somewhere that OMS is really involved in. And so right now, MISO's talking about some changes to how they establish how much capacity is required to serve customers. And so the OMS is all over that, because that's something that is really in line with state jurisdiction over resource adequacy.
Yes, it is. Does every state have a different requirement, or is that something that MISO sets?
That's something that MISO sets. States are technically allowed to set their own requirement just based on the Federal Power Act and how that jurisdiction was given. But MISO every year does a study that basically determines how much capacity is needed to meet the riskiest day and how much excess you might need given the chances that something could be worse than that. And so after they produce their reserve margin study, it then gets allocated out to each utility and all the different states. And then they have to show up and prove that they have enough resources to meet that requirement. So yeah, that's how it's done.
So for our listeners, some of this is outlined for Wisconsin in the Strategic Energy Assessment that the PSC publishes every 2 years. So if you're interested in reading more about where Wisconsin fits in and what our reserve margin is, I think the Strategic Energy Assessment is a good place to read more. But I'm interested, Marcus, have you guys commented on the SEA, or do you provide information for that at all? Or what is your role evaluating that?
So that's a great question. So every state within MISO and within OMS has a different planning process. So some states have prescriptive integrated resource planning processes that their legislatures in their state have given their commission authority and required them to do a planning process and kind of spelled out what that looks like. In states like Wisconsin that do not have an IRP process, and like you said, there's the strategic energy assessment. In that process, the role of OMS is really just making sure that the Wisconsin Commission staff that are involved in putting that together have the resources and information that they need to understand how the rules at MISO connect to what the utilities in Wisconsin are required to do. And so, OMS and I myself will help in getting information and data from MISO. That's a big thing that I do is education and communicating with MISO. And so if I'm able to connect the dots or just answer the questions myself, I do that. And so that's sort of my function as an independent staff. I'm a resource for the state commissions. And so as things like the strategic energy assessment are being put together, I will receive questions and I will help connect the dots with experts at MISO that might be able to answer the questions that I can't handle.
That's great. You mentioned this before, but you have a board member from Wisconsin. I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about your board and specifically from Wisconsin, and then how your board members keep the rest of the state commissions in the loop with what you guys are doing.
Yeah, great question. So the OMS is a nonprofit entity. And so we are really like a trade association of the state commissions in MISO is sort of how I think about it. And so we are overseen by a board of directors, and it's one commissioner from each of those member agencies. And so each of the commissions, some of them have 3 members, some have 5, some are elected, some are appointed. They're all organized differently, which makes my job really fun, keeping track of how all these places operate.
Yeah.
But what it's typically the chair of a commission will designate one commissioner to serve on the board of OMS. And so here in Wisconsin, Chair Vach used to be on the OMS board, but designated Commissioner Huebner to serve on the OMS board after he was appointed a number of years ago. And so that means that we have a subset of all of the commissioners in the MISO region who are paying attention to OMS actively and serving on the board, and they vote to approve all of our official actions. And they are also then, charged with going back to their states and sort of explaining what's going on at MISO and what's happening within OMS. So depending on the state, the authority that's given to the single board member that's on OMS, they might be able to act pretty autonomously and not really go back to their full commission. In certain states, big decisions need to be weighed by the commission as a whole. And so this just happened very recently where we were working on something that we were going to send to MISO, and Commissioner Huebner, as our board member, had to go back to the full Wisconsin Commission and get authority and take up that action before he could act on behalf of the state. And so it varies from OMS member agency to other agencies, but and then a lot of times the staff that are involved in OMS work will be updating each of the commissioners separately to make sure that they have an understanding of what's going on, even though they might not be involved in the day-to-day of what's happening at MISO. It still impacts their jobs because they still have to regulate the utilities in their state. And the utilities in their state are heavily impacted by what is happening at MISO and happening at the FERC level. And so that's another way where like the other commissioners that aren't necessarily on OMS, they still need to know what's going on in order to do their jobs effectively.
Yep, absolutely. So you mentioned the official actions that OMS will take, sometimes needing approval. What are some of the official actions that you might take? Yeah.
So we do a number of different things. So very regularly, we are weighing in at FERC, at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So they are the regulator of MISO. So since MISO is a multi-state energy market, they have a set of rules called their tariff that has to be approved at FERC. So every time you're changing any of their market rules, they have to go to the federal commission and prove that it's going to be just and reasonable, and it's going to be defensible, in courts and things like that. And so the states and OMS weigh in at FERC, and there's a public process, just like all the commissions have, open processes for rate cases and different things like that, where different stakeholders get to weigh in. OMS acts as one of those stakeholders at the federal level for changes that are going on at MISO. And so we are regularly drafting up sets of comments or different interventions in federal proceedings that express the views of states collectively to the FERC. And so that's really helpful for the FERC and the commissioners there, who have to regulate a bunch of different markets all over the country, is if they can get a sense of where most of the states are. And that's really, we try to get as much consensus as possible into OMS documents. If they can quickly and efficiently understand where the states are and what the state regulators think, they will really weigh that heavily in their decision. And so individual states and individual utilities will oftentimes weigh in at FERC as well. But we are trying to distill where there's the most overlap and agreement, and then we communicate that to FERC. And we're also regularly weighing in and asking questions at MISO in different open technical committees and things like that are working on different processes. Because all I do is follow MISO and FERC, I am able to follow a lot more than some of the commissioners are. And so an official action could be that we work together to provide feedback to MISO on things. And so we'll pull the commissions together and say, hey, we want to weigh in at MISO even before it goes to FERC. So we'll get the board together to sign off on, either some policy position or some general guidance of what the states think. And then we'll send that off to MISO and let them consider that in their decision-making process.
I have so much admiration for what you do, Marcus. It's awesome listening to you. It's a big job. You've mentioned a couple times different RTOs, the regional transmission organizations, and MISO is just one RTO out of several. Do you know how many RTOs there are and what some of the differences between them might be?
Yeah, so
besides geography.
Yeah. There's 7 organized wholesale markets in North America. And so there are several that are multi-state RTOs like MISO. So MISO is the biggest geographically. It goes from Manitoba all the way down to Mississippi. So that includes Montana, the Dakotas, over to Michigan, and then down to the middle of the country to a portion of Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So it's huge. So I spend a lot of my time at O'Hare bopping around between all of these different capitals in this giant region. In other parts of the country, there are multi-state wholesale markets in New England, where the 6 New England states are in one market together. The New York ISO is its own market. It's a single state market. And then immediately to our east is what's known as PJM. That's the largest market based on sales and peak capacity. And that is a 13-state market in the mid-Atlantic region. And that stretches all the way into Illinois as well. So, and then to our west, we have the Southwest Power Pool, which is a very large geographically spread out market as well that covers many of the Plains states. And so that is I believe the second biggest geographic market as well. And then there's only one market out in the West, and that's the California ISO, which is a single state market. And so, some of the key differences are how many different states are involved. And so, OMS has the most members at 17. We have to get a lot of people in agreement on things. In California, the commission, is appointed by the governor, and the state kind of also oversees the the wholesale market there, and so it's a lot easier to get alignment on things. But that's another story.
Yes. So, as I was scrolling your LinkedIn profile before this, I noticed something you had posted about the North-South Divide within MISO. Could you tell us what that is and what the history is there and any implications of it now?
Yeah, certainly. So, going back to the origin of MISO that we were talking about earlier, MISO used to be a smaller footprint that stopped in the boot heel of Missouri. So, it didn't used to go down to Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. So, it was, I believe, around 2010, 2011. What's known as the Entergy states, or the southern states that are in MISO, were looking to join an RTO. And so they are a big utility based in New Orleans that operates in those 4 states and the city of New Orleans. And they were either going to join SPP, the Southwest Power Pool, which is to our west, or they were going to join MISO. And so they conducted a study to look at which was the most beneficial to their customers before they joined an RTO. And the results of that study showed there was more benefits to being in MISO. And so they integrated into the MISO system over a 5-year transition period. And that started in 2013 and was concluded in 2018. And so since the time that I've been at the Wisconsin Commission and working on MISO things, the southern portion of MISO has been a part of MISO. And so there is an interesting physical connection between these 2 regions, though. So if you look at the map of MISO, it's a really strange hourglass shape right in the middle of the country. And there's a tiny connection between southern Missouri and Arkansas. And so that's sort of what distinguishes the MISO footprint visually. But on a day-to-day basis, MISO can flow tons of power from the south to the north and from the north to the south and inside and outside of its own borders. And so what MISO is doing is just optimizing its entire system subject to the physics of the transmission system. And so when you look at a map of MISO, you just see the area that MISO is responsible. They're in charge of understanding what's going on inside of those borders. And so whether it's the north or the south region or any other subregion within those big areas, MISO is responsible for maintaining reliability for that whole footprint as one system.
But it's physically connected, right? And are the RTOs physically connected to each other? And what would we call the issues that arise at those connection points?
So this is a great question, something that we should certainly clarify. So just as the utilities in Wisconsin are part of the bigger MISO system, the MISO system itself is part of the larger Eastern interconnection. And so MISO is physically connected to other RTOs and non-RTO regions that are part of one single Eastern interconnection that has to be maintained at the same frequency, and it includes 36 states, a couple provinces, the District of Columbia. They're all in this bigger region. And so MISO is in charge of dispatching energy to serve its load and working with its members to meet demand and as reliably and economically efficiently as possible. But MISO also oversees all transactions across its seams. And so just as utilities have seams, which is, I'm here in Madison, MG&E is a relatively small utility that's surrounded by another utility. And so there's power flowing between these two. And the same is true for RTOs. And so the Chicagoland area, for example, is not part of MISO, even though it's right in the middle of the MISO footprint. There is constantly power flowing between PJM and MISO, and those 2 RTOs are in charge of coordinating that flow and monitoring that flow. And so that's all being done seamlessly and instantaneously by these RTOs. And it is really one of the main benefits of being in a larger power market, is that you're not relying on every single utility in this MISO region to coordinate with all of their neighbors. It's being done at a much bigger scale by MISO. And that kind of irons out a lot of other seams that would have otherwise existed within that region and simplifies things in a pretty great way.
Just before we move off the topic of RTOs completely, I wanted to ask you, do you think there is a demonstrable benefit to being in an RTO? It sounds like there are studies that, are able to show one way or another, but I know not every state or region participates in an RTO. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on the pros or cons of RTOs.
Yeah, I do. I have strong opinions on that. So I am it shouldn't be a surprise that I'm very pro RTO, and the majority of the country, I think it's 2/3 of the electricity demand in the US is part of an RTO. And so there are certain parts in the West and in the Southeast that are not. But the majority of load is served by a utility that itself is served by a larger RTO. So I'll just start there. The main benefits and pros, as I see them, are that when you're using a larger footprint to meet customer demands, you lower the risk for everybody in that region. So this is very true in MISO, where it's a huge region geographically. And so if you are just a single utility out on an island, you have to build all the resources you need for your own load. And then you need to build the excess for in case something goes wrong with any of your resources. And so you are taking that full insurance policy on yourself and on your customers, and that's really expensive. And when you're part of an RTO, if anything goes wrong with one of your resources, you have thousands of other resources that you can access instantaneously, and you can flow power between them in a moment's notice. And so that's a huge insurance benefit from like a reliability standpoint. And then the other thing is just you have access to the cheapest electricity that's available in every 5-minute increment. So what an RTO is doing and what MISO is doing is they are dispatching all of the generation that's across the whole MISO region to serve the last increment of load that's on the system. And so they're only going to dispatch the next most expensive resource to meet that load. So if you're in a utility territory that has a bunch of natural gas generation and natural gas is cheap, your resources will be running a lot. But if it's wintertime and natural gas is all of a sudden really, really expensive, you don't want to be running that and just, increasing electric bills for your customers if there are cheaper generators out there and MISO can flow cheaper electricity to you. So what MISO is doing is ensuring that no resources that are more expensive than they need to be are running. And so it's kind of minimizing that cost function for customers. And that optimization is extremely complex and takes a football field sized room of computers to optimize all of the different generators and all the different loads. But it is what an RTO is doing, and it has a huge hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit, annually type of impact on customers. And then, the other main benefit is what I was just talking about with that seams coordination. It just makes reliability coordination amongst neighbors much, much simpler. And it offloads that responsibility from the utilities. Every utility used to have somebody that coordinated with all of their neighbors. And now that's being handled to some extent at the RTO level.
Thank you. MISO and OMS recently coordinated on a study about resource adequacy. Tell us a little bit more about that. Will our system have enough generation resources to deliver electricity reliably to customers in the near future?
Yeah, so every year OMS conducts a survey with MISO called the OMS MISO Resource Adequacy Survey. that does a 5-year out forward-looking assessment of what we know today about all of the utility plans in the region, and compares that to what is expected to be the demand on the system in the future. And that really is just a snapshot in time. It's what the utilities have announced publicly, kind of what they're planning for in the next 3 to 5 years. And not surprisingly to me, but surprisingly to a lot of other people, most of the time in the out year, it shows a shortage. And so that's because a lot of times utilities don't finalize what resources they're gonna build to meet their demand until it's closer to the present. And so what they will know is that some resources are getting old and they'll be retired, but they haven't made the decision as to what's going to replace it. And they may also know that load is going to go up for any number of reasons. And so sometimes that survey produces this image that shows, oh, in the future, we're going to be out of resources. That hasn't happened. And we've always, if you look out to the future and you don't really know what you're going to choose yet, you won't, artificially say, oh, we're going to be fine. You just want to show what you know today. And so we partner with MISO on that as a really, useful bit of information that states and utilities can use to inform their own processes. You can kind of see where the whole footprint is and all the different, resources that may be available to meet your needs. So that's something that OMS and MISO have partnered on, I think, for about 10 years now. It's been going on for quite a while. I will say that, the big issue that states are working on and that the whole electric industry is working on right now is that the types of resources that are coming on the system are changing. And so the system is being operated differently. There's many more weather dependent resources, and there's a lot of new loads that are becoming electrified. And so it has added a lot of complexity to the system because we have a lot more variation in both load and the output of resources. And so the job of MISO is becoming more complicated to match demand and generation in every millisecond. And so what utilities and states are planning for is becoming much more closely interconnected with how MISO operates. And there is a lot of work that's being done nationally and internationally to understand how do you measure the risk of this system. So you have a certain set of generators, you have a certain load, you have a certain weather pattern, and you need to assess that risk to determine whether or not you're sufficient or not. And as you increase the amount of variables and the rate at which those variables change, it's harder to measure the risk. And so there's a lot of academic and industry work being done in this very area to change how we are going to measure risk in the future. We have a method that's been used for a number of decades that worked when you had a lot of big generators that were somewhat predictable. They'd randomly break down and you could kind of get a sense of that. But now you have the weather doing things that it's never done before. Now you have generators that are tied to that weather, and you have the generators that used to be dependable, that were big and reliable, are now getting older and breaking down more as well. So it's becoming a pretty complicated job for utility regulators and for MISO to understand how we ensure we have sufficient generation.
Is there work being done right now on aggregators and virtual power plants?
Yes, that is happening right now. So that's an exciting area that OMS was really heavily involved with a few years ago. FERC issued Order 2222, which opened up these wholesale markets to aggregated distributed energy resources. And so because, as the name implies, DERs are on the distribution system, and those distribution systems are subject to state commission jurisdiction, that's another area where there's this overlap between the authority of state commissions and now this federally regulated wholesale rule that says that those resources can participate, that are on the distribution system can participate at the wholesale level. OMS was really involved in that. We have a number of states that are really encouraging DERs and aggregated DERs on their systems. And so we needed to help MISO understand where they would be getting visibility into these resources. How would those resources register with either their local utility, and how that communication might happen from the distribution system up to the transmission system. And so it's a very complicated and information exchange intensive process. But it's something that a number of OMS members see a lot of value in, because then you can not only optimize those resources that are connected to the transmission system, you can optimize resources that are much closer to load, and you can try to get benefits from using those as efficiently as possible as well. And so, that's certainly something that OMS has been involved in, and we're still involved in it because it takes a long time. I think FERC first issued the idea for this rule back in December of 2015, if I'm remembering correctly. And so I've been working on that topic my entire time at OMS.
That sounds like so much fun. I love it. Marcus, this has been so helpful. Is there anything we've missed or anything else you really wanted to touch on so people can understand what's happening at OMS and what you do?
I like to try to simplify what RTOs do and what MISO does into two big buckets that I might just try to recap, because we've touched on these throughout the conversation. But the first thing they do is reliability, and they do that through energy markets. So by sending price signals to generators, they adjust, the output on the system, and that maintains the reliability of the transmission grid and make sure that none of those transmission lines are melting down from too much power flowing on them. So that's like number one, is reliability, and that's done through markets. And then the second big thing that they do is transmission planning. So there's a lot of utilities that own transmission lines in the MISO region. They study each of those systems as a whole and make sure that they're not causing problems on their neighboring systems. And so, transmission is subject to NERC requirements, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And so MISO studies all of these different transmission systems and stitches them together and makes sure that they all work cohesively. And so I know we touched on transmission planning and we touched on markets, but I think it's good to just think like that's really the two big things that they do. And then there's a lot within each of those, but those are the high level.
Marcus, if someone wanted to learn lots more about RTOs and MISO and OMS and all of these topics, do you have recommended resources to start? And I've got one in mind, but I'm going to let you say it.
Yes, there's a couple of different great resources to learn more about RTOs. So the one that you probably have in mind is the Wisconsin Public Utility Institute RTO Fundamentals course. And that is really a unique course across the country. So I work with commissioners. Not only do I work with MISO states, I work with commissioners all over the country as well. And this training is very unique in that it's totally focused on RTOs, and there isn't a lot of educational opportunities that's just focused on RTOs. And so we send a lot of OMS members to this training, and that's another big function of OMS is education. So I'm always on the lookout for good educational opportunities, and this is one of the best ones because it's so focused on RTOs. And then, just other things as far as people who are interested in learning more. Most of what MISO does and what OMS does happens in the open. You can go on our websites and see the links to the meetings that we host, and you can dial in and listen along and pay attention if you're so inclined. And so MISO has a lot of great training materials and videos available on their website that have been improving throughout time. So you can go ahead and access those. And then FERC as well has some pretty good high-level reports that they've assembled that kind of summarize the basics of these RTOs and wholesale power markets. So they have some really good written documents that I share with OMS members that are new to the space.
Excellent. Thank you. And we will put links to all of these organizations in the show notes. And I'll just note that the WPUI RTO course typically happens in Madison, but there's also a hybrid online component, and that happens in April each year. Be on the lookout for that, but it's gonna be a little while. So on to our final question for all of our guests, which is, if you had all the power in the industry, Marcus, what would you do with it?
All right. Well, my first question back to you is, how many people give you multiple answers to this single answer?
Very open to multiple answers. I want to hear all of your ideas.
So if I had all the power in the industry, the first thing I would do would be to unretire all of the nuclear plants that retired prematurely. And so I'm a nuclear engineer by training and at heart. And because of some of the rules of these wholesale markets, a lot of nuclear plants were losing money at certain times. And now with this big decarbonization push across the country and at a lot of utilities, they're seeing these plants that they retired early and really kind of regretting it. And so it's a big loss. And, with hindsight, it'd be really obvious to say we shouldn't have retired some of these nuclear plants, including the one that I worked at as an intern up in Kewaunee, Wisconsin. So that's one thing I would do. And that requires a lot of power because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission doesn't like that idea. But that's why it's a fun answer for this one. And then the other thing that I would do if I had all the power is my favorite topic of late is grid enhancing technologies that can really optimize the use of the transmission system. These technologies aren't always in the best financial interest of some of the utilities, but they might, provide a lot of benefits and reliability wise and economics wise for customers. And so if I had all the power, I would just hope that utilities would implement these technologies out of the goodness of their hearts. But that isn't how things are done sometimes. So those are my two responses.
I love it. Thank you so much, Marcus. This has just been so helpful, and we really appreciate the time.
Absolutely. It's been a blast.
Come back anytime.
All right. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Please support our work. You can subscribe to the Electric Wire podcast if you haven't already, and you can follow us on Twitter @The Electric Wire. Thanks also to the members of the Customers First Coalition for supporting this podcast. Our members are Dairyland Power Cooperative, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, WPPI Energy, the Citizens Utility Board, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 2150, and the Wisconsin Electric Cooperatives Association. Thanks again for listening. We'll have a new episode next month.